Greetings from wherever you are participating. This is the Royal Economic Society special series intended to help bring economics and economists to public policy at a critical time. The Bank of England and the Government Economic Service has kindly advised us, but this series is from the Royal Economic Society and completely independent of them. I am Nick Stern and chairing as a past president of the Royal Economic Society. Seminar has been organised from the Grantham Research Institute at the London School of Economics. Speakers today are John Llewellyn and Dimitri Zengelis. Their affiliations will appear on their first slide. Andy Haldane follows me, wearing a hat today as the chair of the Industrial Strategy Council. Gus O'Donnell will moderate the discussion. He's the chair of Frontier Economics. And Sarah Breeden will also, with Andy Haldane, contribute to the discussion. Sarah is Executive Director of the Bank of England. Everyone will be speaking in their personal capacities. This is an extraordinary crisis. The risks on health and economics are immense. We're going to concentrate on the economic here. And in the economics, I think it's helpful to think of three phases: rescue, recovery, and transformational growth. We're going to focus today on rescue. We're going to focus on from rescue to recovery rather than rescue itself, and then on recovery. And in good Keynesian fashion, we have to recognize that we need to act quickly, but we also need to set a path for expectations, investment, and employment. Recovery without rescue is to sink into a hole, and rescue without a plan for recovery is a bridge to nowhere. At the outset, we have to recognize that we have a very serious risk of a global depression. This crisis is truly global, in contrast to 2008-10, which was mainly the financial system in rich countries. We have, as we go from rescue to recovery, battered confidence, deep liquidity problems, disrupted supply. There is no guaranteed rapid bounce back. That will depend on policy around the world. This recovery must be driven, hence this series of webinars. And we must note that, at least in my view, talk of austerity would be dangerous. It would take us deeper into depression. We're going to have to grow out of this one, so our recovery must be the beginnings of a strategy for sustainable growth. We'll focus on the UK, but I hope the principles are general. And as we do that, focusing on the UK, let us recognise the immense difficulties facing so much of the developing world, not only the health and economic crisis, but also falling remittances, falling commodity prices, and capital flight. They are in deep trouble, and we must think internationally. As we plan our future, as we set our targets, let's recognise that there should be no going back. Surely we've learned that the old regime was fragile and dangerous. We have to chart a better way forward: strong, sustainable, resilient, inclusive growth. And could I have my one slide, please? The strong, sustainable, resilient, and inclusive growth should be the plan for the future, and the recovery should be taking us that way. So this slide, my only slide, sets out, as it were, the plan for the webinars. A strong, sustainable recovery clearly will need strategy and investment. That's our first webinar, that's today. Policy to draw through the investments, that's on Thursday. And the right kind of finance in the right place at the right time, that's on Friday. So Thursday and Friday seminars to follow, and they're at the same time as today. The investment that we're talking about must be in all of physical, human, natural capital. And we'll need direct policy too for building and protecting social capital. These four capitals are what will drive us towards sustainability. They're the essence of sustainability. We have to invest in all of them. And we'll see that many of the investments can be what we need: speedy, labor intensive, and sustainable. Think about facilitating bikes and pedestrians in towns and cities, retrofitting buildings, investing in trees, land, water management, training for new skills, and so on. All things we can do quickly and effectively and give us sustainability. The goals that we're going to orient ourselves towards are articulated UK government goals set out here: levelling up, net zero, emissions by 2050, boosting productivity, investing in infrastructure, and forging a global Britain. And let me, just before I close this introduction, comment briefly on tools and methods in economics, remembering that this is a seminar unabashedly for economists, but I hope it will be accessible to anyone who's tuned in. These are not standard economic circumstances. We must use our basic tools of economics, but we'll need broader and deeper economics than perhaps we normally use. In micro, that must go beyond standard cost-benefit analysis. We face here not only marginal decisions or trade-off, but big strategic choices. In macro, we have to go beyond models that automatically take us back to trend. This is not a self-correcting story at the moment that we can rely on. So we've got to look at dynamics of non-linearities, instabilities, and increasing returns to scale, multiple market failures, information, expectations, and unforeseen circumstances, liquidity crises, and so on. So we're going to need all our economics: behavioral, institutional, labor, industrial, finance, draw the lessons of economic history, and much more. We're going to need an economics that involves much more risk and uncertainty than is normal for us. We're going to need all the economics that we're capable of bringing. So let me close with thank yous. Thank you to Andy Haldane and Claire Lombardelli, the head of the Government Economic Service, for advice, whilst emphasising the independence of this series from them, to Gus O'Donnell for participation and guidance, Dimitri Zingalis, Anna Bellero, and Nick Robbins. They choreographed each of them one of the seminars in that order, to Sam Unsworth for splendid overall organisation, Shiv Chawla at the bank, Alison Kilburn at the Government Economic Service, all of whom have been extremely helpful. And finally, to the Royal Economic Society itself, Leighton Chipperfield, the Chief Executive, Brad and Julia, who are involved very much in the technology today, and to my fellow presidents, Tim Besley, Rachel Griffith, and Carol Proper, and of course, to all our speakers. Andy, over to you.
Well, thank you, Nick, for that kind introduction. And thank you too to everyone at the RES for helping organize these 3 sessions on economic recovery. They're a great example of collaboration between academia and the policy community. And that's something I think that's never been more needed than now, given the scale and pace of the collapse in activity that we've seen. I should say, just in passing, I think one of the silver linings from the dark cloud of this crisis has been the rapid and resourceful, indeed radical, response of the economics profession. We've seen publication lags shrink in some cases from 3 years to 3 days, and that's been very welcome at a time for policymakers, at a time of what is still acute and chronic crisis. Let me just say a few quick words by way of intro about recovery before passing the floor to our distinguished panelists, John and Dimitri. And let me just start by scaling what it is we're recovering from. So there are a range of estimates out there, but it's likely in the first half this year in the UK, activity may contract by anywhere between a quarter and a third, and the same is true globally. Not only this quarter will we see the largest contraction activity since quarterly national accounts commenced in 1955, it will be most likely an order of magnitude larger than the second largest contraction in quarterly GDP since 1955. In annual terms, you have to go back at least 300 years to a time when the Bank of England was a teenager to find a time when activity has contracted so sharply and severely. If you looked at the labour market, the picture in some ways is even worse. It's likely right now that somewhere between a quarter and a third of the workforce are either unemployed or underemployed through furlough schemes. I can't imagine there's ever been a time in history when that fraction of the workforce has been inactive. Now, the good news here, I hope, is that as the fall has been atypically large and speedy, it's hoped that the recovery can also be atypically large and speedy as the lockdown begins to be released and relaxed. Indeed, we've seen, encouragingly, some degree of stabilization in some measures of spending over recent weeks, albeit at very low levels. And it's fair to say there's much less sign of that stabilization among some of the labour market metrics. Of the many measures you can look at, one I just came across this morning is looking at Spotify downloads. Apparently, Spotify downloads of the REM song "This Is the End of the World as We Know It" peaked 2 weeks after the lockdown and have been declining over the period since. So perhaps we are seeing some stabilization. Nonetheless, the recovery is what is to play for now in policy terms. So these sessions are crucial for thinking about the right contours of policy for securing that recovery. And against that backdrop, let me mention two features, structural features, that I think will be crucial when it comes to shaping the course of that recovery. All crises leave scars, and this crisis assuredly will be no exception. That scarring affects the pace at which we recover, and indeed the end point to which we recover. And the two aspects of scarring I think particularly interesting right now are balance sheet scarring on the one hand and behavioural scarring on the other. On the first of those, it's inevitable as governments, as businesses, as households bridge over their cash flow shortfalls, that they will build up a stock of debt, an overhang of debt, and that will leave a lasting balance sheet scar. One interesting, I think, question for these three sessions is how best we deal with that overhang, how we prevent that overhang hanging over the recovery. How do we secure growth positive deleveraging, if you like, deleveraging that still allows companies to keep on investing, not just in physical capital, but in their staff as well, as we need those companies, of course, to reabsorb the many millions of workers that are currently inactive. A second, I think, as important dimension of scarring is the scarring to behaviours. We know from behavioural psychologists that events like this, that are large, that are life-threatening, and that are widespread in their impact, leave lasting psychological scars. There is dread risk that leads people to expect large fat-tailed events for a long period thereafter. And that risks encouraging the sorts of precautionary behaviour, prolonged precautionary behaviour by companies and by households that risks pushing us into what Keynes called the paradox of thrift in a longer lived period of subpar aggregate demand in the economy. So what best policies and what best institutions do we need to prevent those scars, whether behavioural or balance sheet? A very last factor, the one that Nick just touched upon, is we shouldn't lose sight, absolutely should not lose sight, of some of the longer term goals of the government and of economic policy when crafting policies for recovery. Nick touched upon all of these, but plainly the net zero objective of government needs to be front and centre in crafting a policy response. Plainly, the levelling up agenda spatially needs to be centre stage when crafting a strategy for recovery. And also, I think we need in future to think about how best to make our economic system, and indeed the sectors within it, more resilient to the sort of left tail events we are seeing right now. There are many more questions there than answers. So that's an appropriate stage, I think, to pass across to our first panelist speaker, John Llewellyn. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andy, very much indeed. I'm going to start with the underlying economic problem, what the French call the problématique. I'm going to take you to the general macro conclusion, if you like, which is that we need more investment, and then Dimitri will take you on and tell you what investment we need and how. So if I could have the first slide, please. Thank you. As you can see there, GDP growth at the level of the G7 economies has trended down over the whole of the post-war period. Now, of course, that doesn't contain China and India. If you put them in, it tells you a similar story, but the slowdown starts later. The second point of the slide, of course, is that there was no major recession in the post-war period until the 2008 global financial crisis. Before the World War, real GDP growth was volatile and recessions were common. After World War II, the G7 grouping went for more than 60 years without GDP ever falling. Now, the reasons for this, of course, are multiple. One is that government expenditure, which is intrinsically relatively stable, had increased to about 40% of GDP in most OECD countries, imparting an overall degree of stability. There were the automatic stabilizers, the tendency of government expenditure to rise and government revenues to fall in a recession. And there were some occasions when there were successful discretionary movements of policy, mainly fiscal policy. The lesson from all of this is that through this period, from the 1960s, growth decelerated progressively. Now, part of this may be due to declining catch-up growth, which was so prominent immediately after the war. Other factors, including structural rigidities, became progressively more important. And of course, latterly, there have been other issues too, demographics, which we all know about, demassification, the lightening of GDP, underspending on infrastructure, perhaps some issues concerned with concentration, and some issues concerned with inequality. So that's background. Now, if I could have the next slide, please. As if all that's not enough, as if that slowdown was not enough, now we've been hit by a huge, as Andy says, a huge negative shock. Now, one of the questions for us all at the moment is how quickly do we come out of that? Andy has expressed the interest, and it's a hope that I share, I think we all would, that we come out of it quickly. Unfortunately, no one knows how long this recession will last. Early scenarios simply assume that we'll come out of it quickly. What this slide does is look at the length of past recessionary episodes. Now, for these purposes, a recessionary episode is measured from the time just before the recession starts until the time when GDP gets back to that level, back to where it started from. Now, typically, if you take these bigger recessions, which we've seen ever since the 1920s, these recessionary episodes are quite long. Their duration is almost invariably at least 3 years. Often the episodes last 4 or 5 years and sometimes longer. And in one case, Italy, in 2019, GDP was yet to get back to where it had been in 2007, some 12 years previously. Now, there's nothing set in stone about such numbers, but what it does suggest is that policy response is going to be extremely important. And obviously it wants to keep that response time down as much as it can. So next slide, please. So recapitulating those 2 points, even before COVID-19, the world economy had problems. So it seems reasonable to expect that once it's recovered, it's likely to face the same issues and in spades, unless policy changes. even before 2008, and most definitely afterwards, the performance of the major economies had become unsatisfactory. GDP growth, as I've shown you, was slow, and so was productivity growth. Furthermore, inflation and nominal interest rates were historically depressed, and most tellingly, so too was the real rate of interest. And the fact that real rates of interest were so low, near zero in so many countries, told us that desired investment worldwide was weak relative to available savings. What the world patently needed was markedly higher investment that would boost demand on the one side and increase supply on the other. So if I could have the next slide, those two phenomena taken together are the super multiplier. Initial investment gives, which is an expenditure, gives rise to successive rounds of expenditure throughout the economy. And the ultimate increase in total spending is thereby greater than the initial first round effect. And those are the key mechanisms for that are shown in the upper part of that diagram. But there's more to the story than that. The increase in investment expenditure not only boosts aggregate demand, it also adds to capacity. And those are the effects shown in the lower part. And the two effects taken together represent or constitute the super multiplier, made famous, of course, by John Hicks. So to the next slide, please, the final slide. So how big are investment multipliers in practice? Well, the answer is that it seems they're helpfully big, likely of the order of 2.5 to 3. Taking first the income expenditure multiplier, its size depends on a number of factors, including the stance of monetary policy, whether or not monetary policy accommodates an increase in investment expenditure, the degree of spare capacity in the economy, and the extent to which successive rounds of expenditure are saved, taxed, or spill over into imports. Estimates of the typical expenditure multiplier, if it's accommodated by monetary policy, lie in the range of 1 to 1.5. And for UK green investments today, something Dimitri will talk about in greater detail, a value towards the upper end of that range seems likely, even probable. So finally, the super multiplier. The size of the super multiplier depends on both the size of the income expenditure multiplier and the efficiency with which the investment is planned, undertaken, and utilized. There are interestingly few estimates of the value of the super multiplier around, but there are some. One set was undertaken by the International Monetary Fund, and another set was undertaken by the OECD using a variety of 3 models for the UK. And if you take all of these together, they were interestingly close from both sources in putting the value of the super multiplier at between 2.5 and 3. In other words, each percentage point of GDP spent on investment can, if it's sustained, be expected to increase UK GDP ultimately by around 2.5 to 3%. That's a very fortunate policy jumping off point. So on that basis, let me now hand over to Dimitri.
Thank you very, very much, John, for that. Well, I'm going to spend the next few minutes presenting evidence which strongly suggests that pulling the world out of recession and sustainably generating the Hicksian super multiplier that John just talks about requires framing a vision of the benefits of government action. In the short run, as Andy just noted, the world faces a Keynesian paradox of thrift. This is what you get when there's a fear of a downturn, leads businesses to cut investment and shed labor, banks to retrench credit, and consumers to slow down on their spending. Of course, when everybody responds in this way, expectations become self-fulfilling in generating the very downturn that was feared. So the primary macroeconomic task before us at this point is to offset this and stimulate private spending, lending, and hiring in the short run. In the long run, the objective is to stimulate investment in complementary assets. In other words, to crowd in activity and indeed capacity. This includes investing not only in physical and produced capital, that is to say, locking into future-proof, productive and resilient infrastructure and not spending public money on propping up things like fossil fuel-intensive assets with limited productivity potential, but also investing in human capital to secure the skills and jobs necessary for the 21st century, as well as retooling and reskilling workers to enable those who have been affected by change to participate in the new economy, which fits in very well, of course, with the government's levelling up agenda. Most importantly, it also involves knowledge and intangible capital, as well as natural capital. Now, I'm going to say a little bit more about the importance of knowledge capital in a minute, but it's worth noting that within intangible capital, investment in social and institutional capital is required to deliver effective and functional government with popular support, rebuilding trust in the social contract, and therefore enabling productive activity. Andy Haldane estimates that the cash-starved social sector, which means things like charities and enterprises with social objectives, which are having a good crisis at the moment through the rise in neighborliness and volunteering, generated the equivalent of about 10% of GDP in recent years. So it's a key complementary asset that needs investment. It also means tackling inequalities, not just in income, but also in wealth and indeed in access to goods and services such as health and housing, transport, education, and even justice. And these are inequalities that, if anything, have been exacerbated by the lockdown following COVID-19. And all this, of course, requires additional support for the ONS to better measure the stock of broad assets. Sorry, can we have the next slide? I think I should have prompted those slides. I beg your pardon. That's the first slide on not panicking. The next slide. And that's the slide just now about expanding capacity. I kind of, sorry, slightly quick firing off the gun without prompting the slides. On to the next slide, which does catch us up. And just to note that against the framing that I've set up and that John has set out, sustainable, resilient and inclusive investment has some very appealing short and long run characteristics in a recession. In the short run, clean energy infrastructure, things like insulation retrofits, building wind turbines, broadband network investment, but also planting trees and restoring wetlands is very labor intensive, and it's not susceptible to offshoring or imports. So consequently, they impart quite high short run expenditure multipliers. In the long run, when we're talking about capacity, the economic multipliers are also high in these sectors. The operation and maintenance of more productive renewable technologies makes them less labor intensive, and energy cost savings are passed on to the wider economy. Next slide, please. Well, in the last recession, the main problem was a lack of shovel-ready climate investment. Well, this time around, the government's net zero program provides a number of investment-focused plans. The ones you see in this slide here are based on a recent letter to the Prime Minister from the chair of the Climate Change Committee. You can peruse these at your leisure later. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on. So next slide, please. Now, I said that I would focus on knowledge capital. Of course, the economy of the 21st century is going to be shaped primarily by knowledge and innovation. This is the key driver of total factor productivity, and it will determine our ability to get more out of the resources we have, resource efficiency, in other words, by directing the weightless economy to foster dematerialization and decarbonization. Now, the sheer scale of the low carbon transition means that network effects and economies of scale in production and discovery, as Nick mentioned already, are just so large that we invariably underpredict the scope for productivity augmenting clean innovation. So just within clean sectors themselves, we've seen an 80% decline over the last decade in key renewable costs, things like solar PV and battery storage. But there's also strong evidence to suggest significantly greater spillovers into other parts of the economy compared with more mature fossil fuel investments. Of course, the low carbon transition is one of many 21st century megatrends that we have to deal with, things like AI, automation, machine learning, and so on. But the inevitability of global decarbonization and the resource efficient shift is one of the closest things we have to a one-way bet. And this can help guide actions and help overcome strategic complementarity problems and inferior Nash equilibria. What do I mean by this? It means that effectively expectations are front and center. If you're a business or a mayor or a politician and you want to invest in green innovation, green investment, and you think no one else is going to, then of course you won't take the risk. However, if you believe that everybody else is going to deploy green technologies, then you will expect the technology costs to fall, the finance to go from niche to mainstream, the policies and supportive institutions to be established, and rapid market opportunities to evolve. So you will invest. And the very act of investing means that if everybody does the same, the expectations become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Once again, expectations, but this time in the long run, are center stage. Strong inertia and high switching costs often make it very difficult to shift innovation from dirty to clean technologies at first, but with credible policy intervention, once we reach a tipping point where expectations change rapidly, technologies can quickly switch from one network to another, as we've already seen. A second interesting feature of these network dynamics is that countries and companies that successfully invest in green capabilities early on have greater success in diversifying into future clean product markets. And then finally, a third feature of this investment is that because innovation is very path dependent and prone to tipping sets and reinforcing feedbacks, conventional economic models, as Nick already hinted, tend to systematically overstate the costs of decarbonization. So this means that rather than trying to fruitlessly predict the future, our efforts might be better spent trying to manage and steer that endogenous transition. Next slide, please. Well, the UK has lagged behind many other major economies in terms of investment and R&D over the last 25 years. I'm not going to dwell on this, again, in the interest of time. You know the story. We've highlighted this many times, for example, in our LSE Growth Commission reports. It's not a very reassuring picture, and it's one that we can certainly improve on and build upon. Next slide, please. Well, of course, there are opportunities from behavioral change. The reaction to the crisis has shown the possibility of rapid changes in the way of doing things. And this offers an opportunity to embed climate and productivity positive behaviors. These include things like strengthening connected technologies through high-speed broadband, improving residential energy efficiency to cut the costs of working from home, better use of urban space, increasing localization and self-sufficiency, reducing reliance on fragile supply lines, but noting importantly that independence is not the same as security. For essentials such as medical supplies or food or energy, global connectivity and collaboration enhances resilience. There's some unfavorable changes that we're seeing. Anecdotal evidence from China, for example, of people shifting from public transport to cars. This testifies to the need to invest in public transport capacity to avoid urban sprawl and the hollowing out of cities. So to conclude, we've come full circle here. We started with behavior and confidence, and we end with behavior and confidence. We've shown evidence that a coordinated strategy to restore confidence requires a credible vision to guide investor expectations. Studies like the New Climate Economy and studies we put out of the LSE have in the past outlined the opportunities associated with low carbon growth and resource efficient growth. These include non-trivial benefits such as tackling pollution, congestion in health and efficiency and so on. But the pandemic gives this vision a new and urgent dimension. So I'll leave you with a closing slide, which suggests, if the next slide, suggests that a lot of people in positions of great influence outside the environmental sphere share the view that addressing these economic and societal and environmental challenges may be exactly the post-COVID medicine that we need. They suggest that the policies with the highest impact and the highest multipliers in many cases are the cleanest and most sustainable. So perhaps more people than we might think share Paul Romer's view that contingent rather than complacent optimism with early action to steer the economy holds the key to shaping future prosperity. And on that note of contingent optimism, I hand it over to Gus.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. I hope everybody can hear me and the video's switched across. Yes, good. First of all, I'm approaching this in the sense of, in my last job as Cabinet Secretary, how would I feel about the way this debate is going? And to be honest, we've heard a lot from epidemiologists. I didn't realize there were quite so many. But the economist voice needs to come through now. It's needed in this transition to exit to balance the different trade-offs that there are, but it's massively needed, as Nick was pointing out right at the start, in the recovery phase. How do we move back to a better normal, not the old normal? And what are the issues that will arise there? And economists, I think, have an enormous amount to say about this. You've already heard from Dimitri and John about a lot of the macro aspects. They've also mentioned what I think are absolutely crucial, the behavioral side of this. Andy's pointed out that this is a really unusual recession, if you like. I mean, almost government induced. We've stopped spending deliberately. So will the past be a good guide to the future? It's different, it's much bigger, and therefore, how do we respond to it? One thing we know is that we'll come out of this with a much bigger state, in the sense of much bigger debt, but also the government has moved into much bigger areas. It's controlled behavior much more seriously and to much greater effect. What does that mean for the future? How do we make this bigger state a better state? How, picking up what Dimitri said, how does the state influence expectations and the nature of this recovery to get us into a better place, not just the place we were before? How do we minimize the scarring from the inevitable massive increase in unemployment we're going to get? How do we get back to what I would say is a better place, a better normal? There will also, it's not just macro, let me point this out, there'll be some micro issues. Labour in future, if you look at a simple kind of capital labour calculation, labour's become more difficult. It's more expensive to hire someone if you need to give them more space, if you need to give them material to operate from home. What are the implications of that for their productivity? How do we help them get to and from work? We saw the government saying, you know, get back to work. Is it Monday? Is it Wednesday? I think it's now Wednesday. But don't use public transport. How? How do we do that in a green way? How do we make public transport work in a world where, for at least a while, we need to maintain the physical distancing rules, which will be difficult? And how, in the longer term, do we convince people that the answer to this isn't, as actually I was rather worried that the Prime Minister said this last night, people getting back in their cars? That seems to me not the right answer. So there's a lot of issues here. I just urge the economist voice to be out there and to be timely. This time round, it's a very different sort of recession. It's a very different kind of problem. We need to be out there analysing the recovery, how best to do it. I would say let's not just look at the GDP figures, let's look at the whole set of data we had this time around, which we haven't had before, on the well-being of the nation, and how do we manage the recovery to get ourselves in a better place, to a much more sustainable recovery. And final point, we know that the virus, whilst being indiscriminate across people, is very, very unequal in its effects on people in terms of their economic effects, not just their health effects. And so those inequalities are really going to be a great problem for a government that has committed itself to levelling up. How can we fit that new recovery into a world where we genuinely think about levelling up, where we've gone through a period where particularly the young, the low-income groups have been very adversely affected by all of this? Right, enough from me. I'm judged with keeping us on time. I'm going to hand over first to Andy Haldane, then to Sarah to give their brief comments on this, and then I'll open up for questions. Please email in your questions, and then we'll select as many as we've got time for, and then I'll finally hand over to Nick to wrap up. So Andy, over to you. Andy, how are you doing? Yes.
There we go. I'm on. Thank you, Gus. And thank you to John, Dimitri. Actually, all three of you cheered me up with your comments. Whether it's John's talk about Hicksian super multipliers, or Dimitri's talk about contingent optimism, or Gus's talk about a louder and stronger economist's voice, I think taking those 3 points together gives us grounds for optimism that a recovery plan could be crafted and hopefully could be listened to, would be listened to by the policy community. I'm going to keep my comments very short because I've already spoken once, but I want to speak to what role industrial policy, industrial strategy might have in recontouring the recovery. I mean, where we start from, the epicenter of this crisis are the joint and of workers. There is a risk, I've discussed it, of a negative feedback loop being generated in the behavior of the corporate sector and the behavior of the labour market, if it were the case that contractions in activity were to generate either actual or fears of unemployment that then generated precautionary saving and further weighed down on aggregate demand. And for me, one of the key jobs of public policy right now is to break us free of that negative feedback loop between the fortunes of companies on the one hand and of workers on the other. And with that in mind, I think a strong case can be made right now for a fairly radical rethinking, repurposing, and reformulation of the UK's industrial strategy and industrial policies to secure greater safety and resilience for the corporate sector that will be key for avoiding this negative feedback loop. What would be the key elements of that repurposed strategy? Well, all of them, I think, have been discussed by our various speakers today, but let me touch upon 6 features that I think would be crucial in that refashioning. The first, of course, is innovation and investment. Both John and Dimitri discussed this and how best that might be reoriented. That'll be crucial, I think, for securing larger numbers of startups, greater degrees of scale up, and therefore larger amounts of both TFP, which has been a missing ingredient for the last 10 years and counting, and simultaneously employment, given the threats in the jobs market that I mentioned earlier on. A second key ingredient, and Dimitri touched upon this, I think we'll be thinking about our economic system in a rather different way, weighing issues of resilience much more heavily than we have previously. In some ways, this is a reprise of the debate we had about the financial sector 10 years ago, where after the fact we discovered that resilience of certain functions of the financial sector was absolutely crucial. And this crisis has revealed similar such critical functions of our economy that we haven't safeguarded as much as we could with the benefit of hindsight. So thinking about the economy as a complex system and how best to secure resilience of its critical features, I think also would be a useful new direction when it comes to industrial policies and industrial strategies. The localization agenda, the onshoring agenda that Dimitri mentioned. A third feature that speaks more to human capital than to physical capital is the skills agenda, and within that, the digital skills agenda. We entered this crisis in the UK with perhaps half the workforce not having the digital skills they needed to do their job well. One perhaps of the positives out of the past 4 to 6 weeks has been that many of us have been forced to make a greater investment in improving our digital skills. There is something important to build on there if the recovery is to continue at pace. Last 3 factors, all familiar. Net zero, the net zero objective of government plainly needs to be front and center in any future industrial strategy. Right now, we have defined the end objective, but have yet to get to the stage of defining the means, the policy means, by which this objective might be met. And both John Dimitri have given us some strong indications that that could be a key, could hold a key to sustainable recovery. Penultimate point, levelling up, clearly crucial for government ahead of this crisis. If anything, the crisis will have put back the cause of levelling up, in that it will, for some sectors and some regions, have made their already difficult situation even more difficult. That, for me, ups the ante further in making sure levelling up is a key aspect of the future industrial strategy of the government. And last but not least, Dimitri touched upon the crucial role that the public sector plays, the private sector plays, but not to forget the crucial role also played by the social sector, by the third sector, and that being a bigger part of our future strategy for recovery, I think is really crucial. Last point from me, Gus. The UK historically has not lacked for industrial policies, has not lacked for industrial strategies, but what they have lacked is scale, what they have lacked is consistency, and what they have lacked is longevity. And one reason for the lack of those three things has been a lack or a weakness of institutional underpinning. So my last hope for recovery, for policies for recovery, would be that accompanying a new strategy for industrial policy, there's an accompanying set of institutional reforms that give those policies some chance of operating at scale consistently and with duration. I think with that, Gus, I will stop. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andy. And we should move immediately to Sarah Breeden. Sarah, can we there, great. Can you unmute yourself, yes?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now you're fine. Fire away.
Brilliant. Excellent. Look, John set out how we need to invest. Dimitri set out how we need to invest sustainably. Andy talked about the industrial strategy that we need to ensure that happens. What I'd like to focus my brief remarks on is how finance can support that real economy investment as we move from rescue into recovery, and with a focus in particular on making sure that that recovery is sustainable as we think about climate change. Now, I'm pretty positive about that for a number of reasons. Most importantly, COVID-19 has been a timely reminder to the authorities and to the financial system of two things. Firstly, that complex system-wide shocks that hit the real economy, whether they're COVID-19 or climate change, inevitably hit the financial system too. It's simply not possible to diversify exposure to systemic risks of that kind. And so if the financial risk is to be managed, so risk in the real economy needs to be reduced. Second, for that real economy risk to be reduced, it needs finance to do so. And it's in the financial system's own commercial interests to provide that finance if it avoids damage to the macroeconomy and so the health of the financial system. That's true of COVID-19 and it's true of climate change too. Now, the financial system has had a glimpse of how necessary policy responses to real economy shocks can create disorderly impacts and financial risks. This particular episode has had unprecedented support from the authorities, and yet it's still causing significant risk to financial institutions. It'd be unwise, I think, to assume that that level of support would be forthcoming in the case of climate change, where the risks have been foreseeable for some time. So instead, the sensible strategy is to invest now to get ahead of that risk. Finally, the financial system is experiencing stranded assets as a new post-COVID-19 normal becomes apparent, whether that's exposures to airlines, office buildings, retail premises, or whatever. And so it's another foretaste of what the financial risk from climate change might look like. So for all of those reasons, as we come out of this stress, I think financial institutions will be more aware than ever of the need to build a sustainable recovery. And that's good news, as Dimitri put it. It's a one-way bet. So our focus should be, how do we best make that happen? Let me quickly cover 4 things, and then I'll go back to you, Gus. Firstly, we must all be relentlessly focused on build back better, whether that's in the public sector, the private sector, the financial system, or the real economy. Secondly, we need coordination and strategy. Andy's point about institutional architecture needing to be there to support the change that we need to make. Thirdly, international engagement. This has taken a bit of a battering through the handling of this crisis, but I'm hopeful that the financial regulators will be able to fill the void here and provide some international leadership there. And then finally, I come back to the point, Gus, that you made. I do think it's really important for the economists to redefine how we measure success. Talk of a trade-off between health and economics is anything but healthy. What we need to do is redefine it, how we measure economic success, and hopefully in so doing, provide the right guiding principles for how we take the recovery forward from here.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That's very timely. Okay, we have not very long, so I'm going to whip on with your questions. First one I've got here is, which I'll read out, one for John and one for Dimitri. First one, John, you might want to handle. How should the economic strategy account for the uncertainty of how the virus will unfold? So, and then for Dimitri, just to be thinking about this, Dimitri, where do you think the risks of austerity and lock-in of carbon-intensive assets are highest, and how should strategy account for this? So John, on how do we account for the fact that the virus is uncertain in terms of how it will unfold? Do you want to kick off?
I can see why you gave that question to me. It's a pretty tricky one. I think that going back to something Andy said about needing to think extraordinarily, it's been wonderful to see the way in which this country's government and some others have come out very quickly and said we've really got to support income. And I hope that that thought persists if we get subsequent waves, because if you don't do that, you've got real problems. Secondly, I think that this is going to last a long time, and therefore it's very important, you said this, Gus, that governments don't then take fright and say, now we need a period of austerity because we're worried about the level of government debt. In other words, I think the short answer I would give is stay the course.
Shall I pick up the next question on austerity and lock-in? Again, a very central question. I'll just say this, with particular regards to austerity. Look, however things pan out, we are going to end up in this country and in other countries with a sharp rise in debt to GDP, ex post. What matters, crucially, is the ex-ante path that we take to get there. The hard way of doing that is obsessing and fixating about restoring fiscal balances, which means that in the end we end up with higher debt to GDP because the government has to bail out the private sector, not just in terms of firms and businesses, but because it has to fund public spending on the back of a collapse in public revenues. The more proactive way of getting to higher debt to GDP is to actually invest early in expanding both expenditure in the short run and capacity in the long run, in the ways that we've talked about in terms of these multipliers. And that puts you qualitatively in a much more sustainable position. Even if you end up with higher debt to GDP, you can actually generate the revenues to repay that debt and it's a much better place to be because living standards and employment will be a lot higher. So let's not fixate about the numerator on debt to GDP. Let's focus on generating growth in the denominator.
Thanks very much, Dimitri. And I'm going to call on Andy to answer this set of questions, but if we've got time, others can come in. Basically, they're all about what can we realistically expect with regard to productivity improvements in the coming years and what can drive them. And in particular, people are asking about what are the particular investments that will make a difference and which ones would actually improve the resilience of our economy. Coming back to that point that you made about being better in coping with future crises. You're currently mute. That's it, Andy.
Thank you, Gus. And it's a great question. It's one we've been wrestling with, of course, even before this crisis for a number of years. And I don't know that the crisis has taught us anything very new about the source of the problem before. The one point I would make on that, and I think it speaks to both parts of your question, Gus, is that we've tended, as a matter of public policy on innovation, to focus on those larger frontier firms that we know to be significant generators of TFP. And perhaps that's been at the expense of thinking sufficiently about the large body of companies who aren't at the frontier. But if you could find a means of mobilizing investment by them, would make a material contribution to lifting our productivity fortunes. That long tail has got much longer over the past 10 years, and the gap between the frontier and the tail has got much larger over that period. One of the big reasons for that, I think, is because that large body of long tail companies probably haven't invested sufficiently in their own processes and products and indeed digital infrastructure. If there were ever a spur for reinvesting in companies' digital infrastructure, it is the events during the course of this year. So I think that there's hope there, perhaps, that if we could find a way of mobilizing that long tail, have them invest in a way that hasn't happened over the last decade or two, that would help lift our productivity spirits on a more durable basis. It would also help, I think, when it came to issues of resilience, because of course in that neglected long tail are a number of sectors, a number of activities that have proven crucial in the difficult times over the past few weeks. I mean, our limited capacity, for example, to produce our own PPE has been laid bare by events. So when I was discussing resilience and those activities that matter most, I think this crisis has shone an interesting light on where we might be focusing our sights in future, which might not be those high innovation, high risk, high return companies. But
thanks, Andy. Sorry, I'm just going to have to cut you off there, and I'm sure there's a lot more you could add to all of that, but I need to hand back over to Nick to summarize where we've got to and what happens next. So Nick, over to you, and thanks to everybody so far.
Thank you very much, Gus. I think we've heard today that we'll not get a rapid bounce back automatically, a rapid one automatically. For a strong recovery, we must act, make policy, make investments, marshal the finance, and we must plan that action now. Failure to act quickly, strongly, internationally is very dangerous. Secondly, we've heard that a sustainable recovery, a green recovery, can bring stronger, faster, more labor intensive, and a more productive recovery than other routes. And further, of course, it's a much more attractive recovery. Think of cities where you can move and breathe, and ecosystems which are robust and fruitful. We really can, if we act wisely and chart this recovery, we can see the way to strong, sustainable, and resilient and inclusive growth. So thank you very much to our speakers and our discussants. Thank you to all those who organized and made the technological side work. And thank you all very much for coming. See you on Thursday and Friday at the same time to look at policy and finance. Thank you all very much.